The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, the great American novel, reimagined as if it had been written by Elmore Leonard. Please like and subscribe to get more of this great content of classic books, reimagined. The Great Gatsby, Chapter 1. Back when I was young and more easily shaken, my old man gave me a piece of advice that stuck with me ever since. Before you go judging anybody, he told me, just remember, not everyone had the breaks you did. He left it at that. We weren't big on deep conversations, but I got what he meant. Because of that, I've made a habit of holding back my judgments, which has led to some interesting people opening up to me and made me a target for more than a few relentless bores. The weird ones can spot this quality a mile away and latch on. So, in college, I got unfairly tagged as a politician, just because I knew the secret troubles of a bunch of wild, unknown guys. Most of the time, I didn't ask for these confessions, often pretending to be asleep, busy, or cracking jokes when I sensed an intimate revelation on the horizon. Young men's heartfelt admissions are usually secondhand and full of gaps. Holding back judgment is an act of eternal optimism. I'm still a bit afraid of missing out if I forget that, like my father snobbishly suggested, and I now snobbishly repeat, a sense of basic decency isn't evenly distributed at birth. And after bragging about my tolerance, I have to admit it has its limits. Behavior can be based on solid ground or shaky excuses, but after a point, I don't care what it's based on. When I came back from the East last fall, I wanted the world to shape up and be on constant moral alert. I was done with wild escapades offering brief insights into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man whose name headlines this story, was an exception. Gatsby, who stood for everything I naturally despise. If personality is a series of smooth moves, then there was something special about him. A heightened awareness of life's promises, like one of those high-tech machines that detect earthquakes from 10,000 miles away. This sensitivity wasn't that flimsy impressionability people call the creative temperament. It was a unique talent for hope, a romantic readiness I've never found in anyone else, and probably never will again. No, Gatsby turned out fine in the end. It was the things that haunted him, the dirty dust trailing his dreams, that made me lose interest in the trivial pains and fleeting joys of men. My family has been part of the upper crust in this Midwestern city for 3 generations. The Carraways are kind of a clan, and there's a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the real founder of our line was my grandfather's brother. He came here in '51, hired someone to take his place in the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business my father runs today. I never met this great uncle, but people say I look like him based on the tough-looking portrait hanging in my father's office. I graduated from Yale in 1915, a quarter century after my father, and soon after joined the Great War. I enjoyed the action so much that I came back restless. The Middle West, once the heart of my world, now seemed like the edge of nowhere. So I headed east to learn the bond business. Everyone I knew was in the bond business, so I figured it could handle one more single guy. My aunts and uncles discussed it like they were picking a prep school for me, and finally, with serious faces, said, "Why, yes." My father agreed to fund me for a year, and after some delays, I moved east for good in the spring of '22. The practical move was to find a place in the city, but it was warm, and I had just left wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a colleague suggested we share a house in a commuter town, it sounded like a great idea. He found a weather-beaten bungalow for $80 a month, but at the last minute, he got sent to Washington, leaving me alone. I had a dog, for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge, plus a Finnish woman who made my bed, cooked breakfast, and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or two, until one morning, a man who'd just moved in stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked, looking lost. I told him, and just like that, I wasn't lonely anymore. I was a guide, a pathfinder, a pioneer. He had unknowingly given me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the burst of leaves growing on the trees, life seemed to start over with the summer. There was a lot to read and plenty of fresh air to breathe. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and investment securities. They stood on my shelf in red and gold, like new money from the mint, promising to reveal secrets known only to Midas, Morgan, and Maecenas. I intended to read many other books, too. I was somewhat literary in college, wrote a series of serious, obvious editorials for the Yale News, and now I wanted to bring that back into my life and become a well-rounded man again. This isn't just a saying. Life is best seen from a single window, after all. It was pure chance that I rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that narrow, wild island east of New York, where two unusual land formations exist. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in shape and separated by a bay, jut out into Long Island Sound. They aren't perfect ovals. They're flattened at one end, but their resemblance must be a marvel to the gulls flying overhead. To those on the ground, their differences are more interesting. I lived in West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though that's a superficial tag. My house was at the tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, squeezed between two mansions that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal imitation of a French hotel, with a tower, new ivy, a marble pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn. It was Gatsby's mansion, or rather, it was a mansion inhabited by a man named Gatsby. My own house was an eyesore, but a small one, and overlooked, so I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the comforting proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the bay, the white palaces of East Egg glittered along the water. The summer's real story begins the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. Just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, besides being one of the most powerful football players New Haven had seen, was a national figure of sorts. His family was enormously wealthy. Even in college, his spending was notorious. Now, he'd left Chicago and come east in a way that took your breath away. He brought a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to believe someone my age could be so rich. Why they came east, I don't know. They spent a year in France for no reason, and then drifted here and there, where people played polo and were rich. This move was supposed to be permanent, Daisy said, but I didn't believe it. I had no insight into Daisy's heart, but I felt Tom would drift forever, looking for the excitement of some lost football game. So on a warm, windy evening, I drove to East Egg to see two old friends I barely knew. Their house was more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn ran from the beach to the front door, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens, and finally reaching the house in bright vines. The front was lined with French windows, glowing with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. Tom Buchanan in riding clothes stood on the front porch. He had changed since New Haven. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30, with a hard mouth and a supercilious manner. His arrogant eyes dominated his face, giving him the look of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of his body. He seemed to fill those boots until they strained at the top, and you could see the muscles shifting under his coat. It was a body capable of great leverage, a cruel body. His voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to his air of fractiousness. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who had hated his guts. "Don't take my opinion as final," he seemed to say, "just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are." We were in the same senior society, and though we were never close, I always felt he approved of me and wanted me to like him in his own harsh, defiant way. We talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing restlessly. Turning me around with a firm grip on my arm, Tom Buchanan swept his broad, flat hand across the front vista, taking in the sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of roses that filled the air with a heady, sweet scent, and a snub-nosed motorboat bobbing on the tide just offshore. "It belonged to Domain, the oil man," he said. His voice was as gruff as ever. Then, just as abruptly, he spun me back around. "Let's go inside." We walked through a high-ceilinged hallway into a bright, rosy-colored room. French windows at either end were flung open, framing the fresh green grass outside that seemed to spill into the house. A breeze blew through, sending the white curtains billowing like pale flags, twisting them up toward the ornate frosted wedding cake ceiling. The breeze rippled across a wine-colored rug, creating shadows that danced like waves on the sea. The only stationary object in the room was an enormous couch. On it, two young women lounged as if buoyed up by invisible strings. They wore white dresses that fluttered and rippled as if they'd just been blown in from a flight around the house. I stood for a moment, taking in the whip and snap of the curtains and the creak of a picture on the wall. Then there was a loud boom as Tom shut the rear windows, and the wind died out, letting the curtains, the rug, and the two women settle slowly to the floor. The younger woman was a stranger to me, stretched out full length on her end of the divan, completely motionless with her chin raised slightly, as if balancing something precarious on it. If she noticed me, she gave no sign. I almost felt compelled to apologize for intruding. The other girl, Daisy, made a half-hearted attempt to rise. She leaned forward with a conscientious look, then laughed, a light, absurd laugh that made me smile as I stepped further into the room. "I'm paralyzed with happiness," she said, her laugh ringing out again, as if she'd said something particularly clever. She held my hand for a moment, looking up into my face with a gaze that promised I was the most important person in the world to her at that moment. That was her way. She hinted in a soft murmur that the other girl was named Baker. I'd heard it said that Daisy's murmurs were designed to make people lean in closer, a trivial criticism that didn't detract from her charm. Miss Baker's lips fluttered as she nodded at me almost imperceptibly, then quickly tipped her head back again, as if the imaginary object she balanced had tottered and given her a fright. Another apology rose to my lips. Any display of complete self-sufficiency always stunned me into admiration. I turned back to my cousin, who began asking me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that made your ear follow each word, like it was a melody never to be heard again. Her face was a mix of sadness and beauty, with bright eyes and a passionate mouth. There was an excitement in her voice that men who cared for her found unforgettable, a compelling tone, a whispered, "Listen," a promise of past gaiety and future excitement. I told her how I'd stopped in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people had sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. The whole town looked like it was mourning. All the cars had their left rear wheels painted black, like some sort of grim wreath. A low, persistent wail echoed from the North Shore all night, making the place feel like a ghost town. "How gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom. Tomorrow." Daisy's voice broke the spell. She added out of nowhere, "You ought to see the baby." Tom Buchanan, a big man with a restlessness that filled the room, stopped pacing and put a hand on Nick's shoulder. "What you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bondman." "Who with?" Nick told him. "Never heard of them," Tom said dismissively. That annoyed Nick. "You will," he replied sharply. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," Tom said, glancing at Daisy and then back at Nick. "I'd be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." Miss Baker, who had been silent until now, suddenly said, "Absolutely." She yawned, stretching like a cat, then stood up with fluid grace. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on that sofa forever." "Don't look at me," Daisy said. "I've been trying to get you to New York all afternoon." "No thanks," Miss Baker said to the tray of cocktails that had just arrived. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked incredulous. "You are?" He downed his drink in one gulp. "How you ever get anything done is beyond me." Nick looked at Miss Baker, intrigued. She was slender, with an erect carriage, and her gray eyes, dulled by the sun, met his with polite curiosity. Her face, wan and charming, seemed familiar. "You live in West Egg," she said disdainfully. "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" Daisy asked, surprised. "What Gatsby?" Before Nick could answer, dinner was announced. Tom, his arm hooked around Nick's, led him out of the room like a chess piece moved to a new square. The women followed, their hands on their hips, swaying out to the rosy-colored porch where 4 candles flickered on the table. "Why candles?" Daisy objected, frowning as she snapped them out. "In 2 weeks, it'll be the longest day of the year." She smiled at everyone. "Do you always watch for the longest day and then miss it? I always do." "We ought to plan something," Miss Baker yawned, sitting down at the table like she was getting into bed. "All right," Daisy said, turning to Nick helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before Nick could answer, Daisy's eyes fixed on her little finger. "Look," she complained. "I hurt it." They all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. "You did it, Tom," Daisy said accusingly. "I know you didn't mean to, but you did. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man. A great big, hulking, physical specimen of a—" "I hate that word hulking," Tom objected crossly. "Even in kidding." "Hulking," Daisy insisted. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, their voices cool and impersonal, just like their white dresses and their eyes. They accepted Tom and Nick, making a polite effort to entertain or be entertained. They knew dinner would end, and soon the evening too, put away like a casual afterthought. It was different from the West, where evenings hurried towards an end in a nervous anticipation. "You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy," Nick confessed, sipping his second glass of claret. "Can't you talk about crops or something?" "Civilization's going to pieces," Tom interrupted violently. "Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by Goddard?" "No," Nick answered, surprised by his tone. "Well, it's a fine book. Everyone should read it. The white race will be submerged if we're not careful. It's scientific. It's been proved." "Tom's getting very profound," Daisy said with unthoughtful sadness. "He reads deep books with long words in them." "These books are scientific," Tom insisted. "It's up to us, the dominant race, to watch out, or these other races will take over." "We've got to beat them down," Daisy whispered fiercely toward the sun. "You ought to live in California," Miss Baker began, but Tom cut her off by shifting heavily in his chair. "We're Nordics," Tom declared. "We've produced everything that makes civilization, science, art, and all that. Do you see?" There was something pathetic in his concentration. When the phone rang inside, Daisy seized the interruption, leaning towards Nick. "I'll tell you a family secret," she whispered enthusiastically. "It's about the butler's nose. Want to hear? That's why I came over tonight." Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some rich folks in New York. He polished it from morning till night until it affected his nose. "Things went from bad to worse," Miss Baker suggested. "Yes, until he had to give up his position." The last sunshine fell affectionately on Daisy's glowing face as she spoke. Then the glow faded, leaving her face in the shadow. The butler murmured something to Tom, who frowned and went inside without a word. Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing. "I love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he?" She turned to Miss Baker. "An absolute rose?" This was untrue. Nick wasn't even faintly like a rose. She was extemporizing, but a warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to reach out through her words. Suddenly, she threw her napkin on the table and excused herself, going inside. Miss Baker and Nick exchanged a glance devoid of meaning. He was about to speak when she sat up alertly and said, "Shh." A subdued murmur came from inside, and Miss Baker leaned forward trying to hear. The murmur grew, then ceased altogether. "This Gatsby is my neighbor," Nick began. "Don't talk, I want to hear what happens." "Is something happening?" Nick asked innocently. "You mean to say you don't know?" Miss Baker was honestly surprised. "I thought everybody knew." "I don't. Tom's got some woman in New York." "Got some woman?" Nick repeated blankly. Miss Baker nodded. "She might have the decency not to telephone him at dinner time, don't you think?" Almost before Nick grasped her meaning, there was the sound of a dress and the crunch of leather boots, and Tom and Daisy returned to the table. "It couldn't be helped," Daisy cried with tense gaiety. She sat down, glanced at Miss Baker, then at Nick, and continued. "I looked outside for a minute. It's romantic out there. There's a bird on the lawn. I think it's a nightingale. It's singing away." Her voice sang, "Isn't it romantic, Tom?" "Very romantic," Tom said miserably to Nick. "After dinner, I want to show you the stables." The phone rang inside, and Daisy shook her head at Tom. The subject of the stables and everything else vanished. Candles were lit again, pointlessly. Nick wanted to look at everyone, yet avoid all eyes. He couldn't guess what Daisy and Tom were thinking, and even Miss Baker seemed affected by the phone call. Tom and Miss Baker strolled back into the library with several feet of twilight between them, as if to a vigil. Nick followed Daisy to the front porch. In its deep gloom, they sat on a wicker settee. Daisy took her face in her hands, her eyes moving out into the dusk. Nick sensed her turbulent emotions and asked about her little girl. "We don't know each other very well, Nick," she said suddenly. "Even if we are cousins, you didn't come to my wedding. I wasn't back from the war." "That's true," she hesitated. "I've had a very bad time, Nick. I'm pretty cynical about everything." Evidently, she had reason to be. Nick waited, but she didn't say more. So he asked about her daughter again. "She talks and eats, right?" "Oh, yes." She looked at him absently. "Listen, Nick. Let me tell you what I said when she was born. Want to hear? Very much. It'll show you how I've gotten to feel about things. She was less than an hour old and Tom was God knows where. I woke up out of the ether and asked if it was a boy or a girl. They said it was a girl, and I turned away and wept. All right, I said. I'm glad it's a girl. I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world. A beautiful little fool. Everything's terrible anyhow, she went on. Everybody thinks so. The most advanced people. I've been everywhere and done everything. Her eyes flashed around with defiant scorn. Sophisticated. God, I'm sophisticated. When her voice stopped, Nick felt the insincerity of her words. He waited, and she looked at him with a smirk, as if asserting her membership in some secret society to which she and Tom belonged. Inside, the crimson room was bright. Tom and Miss Baker sat at either end of the couch, and she read aloud from the Saturday Evening Post. The words, murmurous and uninflected, flowed together in a soothing tune. When Nick and Daisy entered, Miss Baker lifted a hand to silence them. To be continued, she said, tossing the magazine aside. She moved restlessly and stood up. 10 o'clock, she remarked, apparently finding the time on the ceiling. Time for this good girl to go to bed. Jordan's playing in a tournament tomorrow, Daisy explained, over at Westchester. Oh, you're Jordan Baker. Nick now recognized her face. He'd seen it in rotogravure pictures of the sporting life. He'd heard some story about her, but he couldn't remember what it was. Good night, she said softly. Wake me at 8, won't you? If you'll get up. I will. Good night, Mr. Carraway. See you anon. Of course you will, Daisy confirmed. In fact, I think I'll arrange a marriage. Come over often, Nick, and I'll sort of fling you together. You know, lock you up accidentally in linen closets and push you out to sea in a boat and all that sort of thing. Good night, called Miss Baker from the stairs. I haven't heard a word. She's a nice girl, Tom said after a moment. They shouldn't let her run around like this. Who shouldn't? Daisy asked coldly. Her family. Her family is one aunt about 1,000 years old. Besides, Nick's going to look after her, aren't you, Nick? She's going to spend lots of weekends here this summer. The home influence will be good for her. Daisy and Tom looked at each other in silence. Is she from New York? Nick asked quickly. From Louisville. Our white girlhood was passed together there. Our beautiful white... Did you give Nick a little heart-to-heart talk on the veranda? Tom demanded suddenly. Did I? She looked at Nick. I can't remember, but I think we talked about the Nordic race. Yes, I'm sure we did. Don't believe everything you hear, Nick, Tom advised. Nick said lightly that he had heard nothing at all, and a few minutes later he got up to leave. They came to the door with him, standing in a cheerful square of light. As Nick started his motor, Daisy called out, Wait, I forgot to ask you something. We heard you were engaged to a girl out west. That's right, Tom confirmed. We heard you were engaged. It's a libel. I'm too poor. But we heard it, Daisy insisted. We heard it from 3 people, so it must be true. Nick was touched by their interest, but also confused and a little disgusted. As he drove away, it seemed Daisy should rush out of the house with her child, but she had no such intentions. Tom having a woman in New York was less surprising than him being depressed by a book. Something made him nibble at stale ideas, as if his physical egotism no longer nourished his heart. It was deep summer on the roadhouse roofs and in front of garages with new red petrol pumps and pools of light. When Nick reached his estate at West Egg, he sat for a while on an abandoned grass roller in the yard. The wind had died, leaving a bright night with wings beating in the trees. The silhouette of a cat moved across the moonlight, and Nick saw he wasn't alone. A figure stood 50 feet away, hands in pockets, regarding the stars. Something in his movement suggested it was Gatsby himself, come out to claim his share of the heavens. Nick decided to call to him. Miss Baker had mentioned Gatsby at dinner, and that would do for an introduction. But he didn't call, for Gatsby stretched his arms toward the dark water, and Nick could have sworn he was trembling. Nick glanced seaward and saw nothing but a single green light, minute and far away. When he looked back, Gatsby had vanished, and Nick was alone again in the unquiet darkness. Chapter 2. Please like and subscribe to get more of this great content of classic books, reimagined. About halfway between the glitter of West Egg and the grime of New York, the motor road hooks up with the railroad for a stretch, like they're both trying to avoid a place no one wants to see. This is the Valley of Ashes, a desolate farm where the ground is sown with soot and the crops are dust. The landscape is a nightmare of gray, where everything, houses, chimneys, people, is slowly crumbling back into the earth. Every so often, a string of gray cars drags itself along a hidden track, groaning like the dead. When it stops, the ash-gray men with their leaden shovels swarm it, kicking up clouds of powder that cloak their movements. But above this wasteland, there's something that sticks out. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. They're huge, blue, and brooding, peering through a pair of enormous yellow spectacles. These eyes don't belong to any face. They float there, a remnant of some long-gone oculist's wild marketing scheme. The paint's peeling and the weather's worn them down, but they keep their silent vigil over the dump. The valley's got a small, filthy river running along one edge, and when the drawbridge goes up to let barges through, trains stop, and the passengers get an eyeful of the bleak scenery. It was during one of these stops that I first met Tom Buchanan's mistress. Everyone knew Tom had a woman on the side, and they didn't like it much. He'd drag her to cafes, leave her sitting while he chatted up anyone he knew. I wasn't keen on meeting her, but I didn't have a choice that day. I was with Tom on the train, and when we hit the ash heaps, he stood up, grabbed my elbow, and yanked me out of the car. "We're getting off," he barked. "I want you to meet my girl." Tom had probably tanked up a lot at lunch, and he was in no mood for refusal. So I followed him over a whitewashed railroad fence and along the road under the unblinking eyes of Dr. Eckelberg. We stopped at a small yellow brick building, alone at the edge of the wasteland. It had 3 shops, one for rent, an all-night diner, and George B. Wilson's garage. The garage was a sad sight, with a dust-covered wreck of a Ford crouching in a corner. It felt like a front for something grander that might be upstairs. But that illusion shattered when the owner came out. George Wilson was a blond, spiritless man, pale and faintly handsome. Hope flickered in his light blue eyes when he saw Tom. "Hello, Wilson," Tom said, slapping him on the shoulder. "How's business?" "Can't complain," Wilson lied. "When are you going to sell me that car?" "Next week. My guy's on it now. Works pretty slow, don't he?" "No, he doesn't," Tom said coldly. "And if that's your attitude, maybe I'll sell it somewhere else." "I didn't mean that," Wilson backtracked quickly. His voice trailed off as Tom's impatience grew. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, and a woman filled the doorway, blocking the light. She was in her 30s, a bit plump, but she wore it well. Her dress, dark blue crepe de chine with spots, didn't hide her sensuality. She wasn't beautiful, but she had a smoldering vitality. She smiled slowly, walked past her husband like he was a ghost, and shook Tom's hand, looking him straight in the eye. Then she licked her lips and spoke to her husband without turning. "Get some chairs, why don't you, so somebody can sit down?" "Oh, sure," Wilson mumbled, and faded into the background to fetch chairs. Dust veiled his suit and hair, but it seemed to avoid his wife, who moved close to Tom. "I want to see you," Tom said intently. "Get on the next train." "All right. I'll meet you by the newsstand on the lower level." She nodded and drifted away as George returned with 2 chairs. We waited for her down the road, out of sight. A scrawny Italian kid was setting off firecrackers by the railroad tracks. "Hell of a place, isn't it?" Tom said, frowning at Dr. Eckelberg's eyes. "Awful," I agreed. "It's good for her to get out." "Doesn't her husband mind?" "Wilson? He thinks she's visiting her sister in New York. He's so dumb he doesn't know he's alive." So we headed into New York together, though not quite together. Mrs. Wilson took another car, a nod to East Egg sensibilities. In New York, she'd changed into a brown muslin dress that clung to her hips. At the newsstand, she picked up a town tattle and a movie magazine, then bought some cold cream and a small flask of perfume from the station drugstore. Outside, she let a few cabs go by before choosing a lavender one with gray upholstery. Once inside, she leaned forward and tapped sharply on the front glass, snapping at the driver to get moving. "I want to get one of those dogs," Myrtle said earnestly, her eyes lighting up. "I want to get one for the apartment. They're nice to have, a dog." We pulled up to a gray old man who looked like a down-and-out version of John D. Rockefeller. A basket hung from his neck, packed with a dozen squirming puppies of an indeterminate breed. "What kind are they?" Myrtle asked eagerly as he came up to the taxi window. "All kinds, lady. What kind you want?" "I'd like a police dog. You got any of those?" The man squinted into the basket, then reached in and pulled out a pup by the scruff of its neck. It wriggled, its white paws flashing against its muddy brown coat. "That's no police dog," Tom said flatly. "No, not exactly," the old man conceded. "More of an Airedale." He patted the puppy's back. "Look at that coat. This one'll never catch cold." Myrtle's enthusiasm bubbled over. "I think it's cute. How much?" The man looked at the pup like it was a prized possession. $10. The Airedale, or whatever it was, exchanged hands and settled into Myrtle's lap. She stroked its fur, her face glowing. "Is it a boy or a girl?" she asked delicately. "That dog? That dog's a boy," Tom snorted. "It's a bitch," he said decisively. "Here's your money. Go buy 10 more dogs with it." We drove over to Fifth Avenue, the streets warm and soft, almost pastoral in the summer sun. It felt like a scene from a different world. "Hold on," I said. "I have to leave you here." "No, you don't," Tom interjected quickly. "Myrtle will be hurt if you don't come up to the apartment. Won't you, Myrtle?" "Come on," she urged. "I'll call my sister Catherine. People say she's beautiful." "Well, I'd like to, but..." We continued, cutting back through the park toward the West Hundreds. The cab stopped at 158th Street, outside a white apartment building. Myrtle gathered her dog and purchases, casting a regal glance around the neighborhood before heading inside. "I'm going to have the McKees up," she announced as we rode the elevator. "And I have to call my sister, too." The apartment was on the top floor. Small living room, small dining room, small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crammed with oversized tapestried furniture, so every move was an obstacle course through scenes of Versailles. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph of what looked like a hen on a rock, but from a distance, it morphed into an old lady in a bonnet. Old copies of Town Tattle and Scandal magazines littered the table. Myrtle busied herself with the dog, while a reluctant elevator boy fetched a box of straw and some milk, adding a tin of hard dog biscuits. One biscuit decomposed in the milk all afternoon. Tom pulled out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau. I've only been drunk twice in my life. That afternoon was the second time. The apartment stayed bright with sunlight until past 8, but my memory of it is hazy. Myrtle, now on Tom's lap, made several phone calls. When they ran out of cigarettes, I went to the corner drugstore. When I returned, they were gone. So I sat in the living room and tried to read Simon Called Peter, but it made no sense, either because of the whiskey or the book's inherent terribleness. Tom and Myrtle reappeared just as the company began to arrive. Catherine, Myrtle's sister, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid bob of red hair and a milky complexion. Her plucked and redrawn eyebrows gave her a perpetually surprised look. She wore a clinking collection of pottery bracelets that jangled with every move. Mr. McKee, a pale, feminine man from the flat below, had just shaved, leaving a spot of lather on his cheekbone. He was respectful to everyone, and later I learned he was a photographer who'd made the dim enlargement of Myrtle's mother. His wife was shrill, languid, and handsome in a horrible way. She proudly informed me her husband had photographed her 127 times since they'd been married. Myrtle had changed into an elaborate, cream-colored chiffon dress, her personality inflating with the new outfit. Her gestures and assertions grew more grandiose, until she seemed to be spinning on a creaky pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she shouted to her sister, "most men will cheat you every time. They only care about money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and you'd think she removed my appendix when I saw the bill." "What was her name?" asked Mrs. McKee. "Mrs. Eberhardt. She makes house calls." "I love your dress," Mrs. McKee said. "It's adorable." Myrtle raised an eyebrow. "It's just a crazy old thing. I slip it on when I don't care how I look." "It looks wonderful on you," Mrs. McKee insisted. "If Chester could photograph you in it, it'd be something special." We all looked at Myrtle, who flicked a strand of hair from her eyes and smiled brilliantly. Mr. McKee studied her, then said, "I should change the light, bring out the features more, and capture the hair." "I wouldn't change a thing," Mrs. McKee interjected. "Shh," her husband said. We all turned back to Myrtle. Tom yawned and stood. "You McKees want a drink? Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everyone falls asleep." Myrtle rolled her eyes. "I told the boy about the ice. These people, you have to keep after them." She laughed pointlessly, then flounced over to the dog, kissed it, and swept into the kitchen as if a dozen chefs awaited her orders. "I've done some nice work out on Long Island," Mr. McKee said. Tom looked at him blankly. "2 of them are framed downstairs." "2 what?" Tom demanded. 2 studies, Montauk Point, the gulls in Montauk Point, the sea. Catherine sat beside me. Do you live on Long Island too? I live at West Egg. Really? I was at a party there last month. At Gatsby's. Do you know him? I live next door to him. They say he's related to Kaiser Wilhelm. That's where his money comes from. Really? She nodded. I'd hate for him to have anything on me. Mrs. McKee pointed at Catherine. Chester, you could do something with her. Mr. McKee nodded, turning his attention to Tom. I'd like to do more work on Long Island. All I need is a start. Ask Myrtle, Tom laughed as she returned with a tray. She'll write you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle? What? You'll introduce McKee to your husband so he can photograph him, George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump, or something. Catherine leaned close. Neither of them can stand the person they're married to. Can't they? Nope. What I say is, why stay with them? They should get a divorce and marry each other. Doesn't she like Wilson either? Myrtle, who'd overheard, answered with a violent, obscene retort. See? Catherine said triumphantly. It's his wife keeping them apart. She's Catholic. They don't believe in divorce. Daisy wasn't Catholic, and I was shocked by the lie. When they get married, Catherine continued, they're going west until it blows over. It'd be more discreet to go to Europe. Do you like Europe? I just got back from Monte Carlo. Really? Last year, went with another girl. We had $1,200, but lost it all in 2 days. God, I hated that town. The sky outside bloomed Mediterranean blue before Mrs. McKee's voice pulled me back. I almost married a kike, she declared. If I hadn't met Chester, he'd have got me. Yes, Myrtle nodded, but you didn't marry him. I know I didn't. Well, I married mine, and that's the difference. Why did you? Catherine asked. No one forced you. Myrtle considered. I thought he was a gentleman, knew about breeding, but he's not fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him, Catherine said. Who said that? Myrtle cried. I never was any crazier about him than I am about that man there. She pointed at me, and everyone stared. I tried to look neutral. The only crazy thing I did was marry him. He borrowed a suit for the wedding and didn't tell me. The guy came for it one day, and I cried all afternoon. She should leave him, Catherine said to me. They've been over that garage 11 years. Tom's her first sweetie. A second bottle of whiskey was in constant demand. Tom sent for sandwiches, a full supper in themselves. I wanted to walk through the twilight to the park, but wild arguments kept pulling me back. Myrtle scooted close and whispered about her first meeting with Tom. It was on the train. I couldn't keep my eyes off him. When we got to the station, his white shirt front pressed against my arm, and I told him I'd call a policeman, but he knew I lied. When we got into a taxi, I didn't know I wasn't on the subway. All I thought was, you can't live forever. She turned to Mrs. McKee, laughing. I'll give you this dress when I'm through with it. I need a new one tomorrow. A massage, a wave, a dog collar, an ashtray, a wreath for Mother's grave. I need a list so I don't forget. It was 9 o'clock. Soon it was 10. Mr. McKee slept in a chair, fists clenched. I wiped a spot of dried lather from his cheek. The dog sat on the table, blind eyes staring through the smoke, occasionally groaning. People disappeared and reappeared, made plans, lost each other, found each other. Toward midnight, Tom and Myrtle argued fiercely about whether she could mention Daisy's name. Daisy, 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 Myrtle shouted. I'll say it whenever I want. Daisy, Tom broke her nose with his open hand. Blood and confusion ensued. Mr. McKee woke and stumbled toward the door, staring at the scene, his wife and Catherine scolding and consoling, Myrtle bleeding on the couch. He left, and I followed. Come to lunch, he suggested as we descended in the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, the elevator boy snapped. I didn't know I was touching it, Mr. McKee said. I'll be glad to, I agreed. I found myself standing by his bed, him in his underwear, portfolio in hand. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brooklyn Bridge. Then I was half asleep in the cold lower level of Pennsylvania Station, staring at the Morning Tribune, waiting for the 4 o'clock train. Chapter 3. Please like and subscribe to get more of this great content of classic books reimagined. There was music from Gatsby's place all summer long. His blue gardens were alive with men and women, flitting around like moths among whispers, champagne, and stars. In the afternoons, I'd watch his guests dive off his raft or soak up the sun on his private beach, while his motorboats carved through the waters of the Sound, pulling aquaplanes over waves of foam. Come the weekend, Gatsby's Rolls-Royce transformed into a party bus, ferrying people to and from the city from dawn till the dead of night, while his station wagon buzzed around like a yellow bee, collecting arrivals from the train. By Monday, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, worked themselves to the bone with mops, scrub brushes, hammers, and shears, fixing the chaos left behind. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from New York, and by Monday, those same fruits left Gatsby's kitchen in a mountain of juiceless halves. He had a machine in the kitchen that could juice 200 oranges in half an hour if a butler kept his thumb on a button. Every other week, a squad of caterers descended with rolls of canvas and strings of colored lights to turn Gatsby's garden into a fairyland. Buffet tables groaned under the weight of glistening hors d'oeuvres, spiced hams, artistic salads, pastry pigs, and golden turkeys. The main hall featured a bar with a brass rail stocked with gins, liquors, and cordials so ancient that most of the female guests didn't know what they were. By 7 in the evening, the orchestra arrived. Not some small combo, but a full band with oboes, trombones, saxophones, viols, cornets, piccolos, and drums. The last swimmers came in from the beach and headed upstairs to change. Cars from New York lined the driveway 5 deep. The halls, salons, and verandas were awash in bold colors, bobbed hair, and extravagant shawls. The bar was in full swing, and cocktails floated through the garden, filling the air with chatter, laughter, and casual flirtations. Groups formed, disbanded, and reformed with new arrivals, while confident young women moved like dancers, becoming the center of attention, then gliding away to the next group. One of these girls, wearing a shimmering opal dress, seized a cocktail and downed it for courage before dancing out alone on the canvas platform. The orchestra leader caught her rhythm, and a rumor spread that she was Gilda Gray's understudy from the Follies. The party had officially started. I believe I was one of the few actually invited to Gatsby's. People didn't need invitations. They just showed up. They piled into cars, headed to Long Island, and somehow ended up at Gatsby's door. Introductions were made by those who knew Gatsby, and the partygoers conducted themselves like they were at an amusement park. Many came and went without ever meeting Gatsby, drawn by the sheer spectacle of it all. But I had been invited. A chauffeur in a robin's egg blue uniform delivered a formal note from Gatsby himself, inviting me to his little party that night. It was signed with a flourish, J. Gatsby. I dressed in white flannels and arrived at Gatsby's a little after 7, feeling awkward among the swirls of unfamiliar faces. I recognized a few from the train, and there were many young Englishmen in sharp suits, speaking in low, earnest voices to prosperous Americans, trying to sell bonds, insurance, or cars. They were painfully aware of the easy money around and believed it was within their grasp if they said the right words. I tried to find Gatsby, but no one seemed to know or care where he was. After a few puzzled stares, I slunk over to the cocktail table, the only place where a lone man could linger without looking out of place. And just as I was about to get roaring drunk out of sheer embarrassment, Jordan Baker appeared at the top of the marble steps, looking down at the garden with contemptuous interest. "Hello," I shouted, my voice booming unnaturally across the crowd. "I thought you might be here," she replied absently, acknowledging me with a casual touch of her hand, which she held like a promise to attend to me in a moment. 2 girls in identical yellow dresses stopped at the foot of the steps to greet her. "Hello," they cried together. "Sorry you didn't win." That was for the golf tournament she'd lost in the finals the week before. "You don't know who we are," one of the girls said, "but we met you here a month ago." "You've dyed your hair since then," Jordan remarked, turning her attention to the premature moon, which had probably come out of the caterer's basket. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting on mine, we wandered through the garden. A tray of cocktails floated toward us, and we sat at a table with the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each introduced as Mr. Mumble. "Do you come here often?" Jordan asked the girl beside her. "The last time was when I met you," the girl replied confidently. She turned to her friend. "Wasn't it, Lucille?" Lucille nodded. "I like to come. I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. Last time I tore my gown on a chair. Gatsby asked for my name and address, and within a week I got a new evening gown from Quarrier's." "Did you keep it?" Jordan asked. "Sure. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender beads, $265. There's something funny about a guy who'd do that, the other girl said eagerly. He doesn't want trouble. Who doesn't? I asked. Gatsby. Someone told me. The girls and Jordan leaned together conspiratorially. Someone told me they thought he killed a man once. A thrill passed over us. The three Mr. Mumbles leaned in eagerly. I don't think it's that, Lucille said skeptically. He was a German spy during the war. One of the men nodded. I heard that from a guy who knew him in Germany. Oh no, the first girl objected. He was in the American Army during the war. As our credulity switched to her, she added, You look at him when he thinks nobody's watching. I bet he killed a man. We all shivered and turned to look for Gatsby, caught up in the romantic speculation. The first supper, there'd be another after midnight, was being served, and Jordan invited me to join her party on the other side of the garden. It consisted of 3 married couples and Jordan's date, a persistent undergraduate convinced that Jordan would eventually give in to his advances. Unlike the rest of the party, they maintained a dignified air, representing the staid nobility of East Egg, carefully guarding against the wild gaiety of West Egg. Let's get out of here, Jordan whispered after a stifling half-hour. This is too polite for me. No. We got up and she explained we were going to find Gatsby. I had never met him, she said, and it made me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded cynically. The bar was crowded, but no Gatsby. He wasn't on the veranda either. On a whim, we tried an imposing door and walked into a high Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak, likely imported from some ancient ruin. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed glasses sat on the edge of a great table, staring intently at the books. As we entered, he turned excitedly and examined Jordan from head to foot. What do you think? He demanded impulsively. In the dimly lit corner of the lavish room, crammed with Gatsby's eclectic collection of real, hardbound books, a guy with a grin too sharp for his own good was making a show of it. About what? His voice had the casual drawl of someone who's played too many poker hands. He waved toward the bookshelves with a flourish. About that. And don't bother checking. I already did. They're real. The books? I asked, skeptical but intrigued. He nodded eagerly. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be just for show, durable cardboard or something. But no, these are the real deal. Let me show you. He didn't wait for an invite, just barreled over to the shelves and snatched the first volume of the Stoddard Lectures. See? He thrust the book at me like he was revealing a hidden weapon. It's bona fide printed matter. This fella's a regular Belasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness. What realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect? He ripped the book back before I could even leaf through a page, slotting it back into its nook with a clatter that suggested the whole setup might collapse if you pulled the wrong one. Who brought you? He demanded abruptly, eyes narrowing with a detective's suspicion. I was brought. Most people were brought. He paused, cocked his head. I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt, Mrs. Claude Roosevelt. Do you know her? Met her last night. I've been drunk for about a week now and thought it might sober me up to sit in a library. Has it? I played along. A little bit, I think. Can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us. I cut in before he could rerun the whole show. We shook hands with him, more out of formality than any real warmth, and stepped back out into the fresh air. The garden was alive with a disjointed orchestra of movements. Old men clumsily escorting young girls in graceless circles, couples tangled up in each other so tight it looked like a chore, and a slew of single girls either dancing solo or taking a brief turn with the musicians. The night had warmed up with activity. A celebrated tenor had let loose in Italian, and a notorious contralto countered with jazz. Between sets, the crowd pulled off stunts that sparked bursts of laughter into the night sky. I still had Jordan Baker by my side, and we found ourselves at a table with a guy about my age and a girl who could burst into laughter at the drop of a hat. 2 glasses of champagne deep, the night shifted before me into something more significant, something profound. During a pause in the pandemonium, the guy turned to me with a half-cocked smile. Your face is familiar, he ventured. Weren't you in the 1st Division during the war? Yeah, the 28th Infantry. I confirmed. I was with the 16th until June 18. I knew I'd seen you somewhere. We exchanged brief memories of drizzly, muddy villages in France. He mentioned he'd just bought a hydroplane and planned to test it in the morning over the Sound. Want to come with me, old sport? Just off the shore along the Sound. What time? Any time that suits you best. I was about to ask his name when Jordan, ever alert, interjected with a smile. Having a good time now? Much better. I turned back to my new acquaintance. This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there. I gestured vaguely towards a hedge that was barely visible in the night, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a beat, he looked puzzled. Then it clicked. I'm Gatsby, he declared suddenly. What? I blurted a bit too loudly. Oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. His smile was knowing. One of those rare ones that seemed to wrap you in reassurance, making you believe it knew precisely how you wanted to be seen. As we were wrapping up, a butler hurried over, whispering that Chicago was on the line for him. Gatsby excused himself with a grace that made you feel part of something important. If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport, he said before disappearing. I turned to Jordan, momentarily stunned. I had expected Gatsby to be some flamboyant middle-aged mogul. Not this. Refined yet rough around the edges, speaking with a precision that almost seemed rehearsed. Who is he? I demanded, unable to mask my curiosity. He's just a man named Gatsby, Jordan replied, her smile thinning a bit. Where's he from, though? And what does he do? Now you're started on the subject, she answered, her tone dipping into weariness. He told me once he was an Oxford man. That statement hung in the air, gaining weight and mystery until she added, though I don't believe it. Why not? I just don't think he went there. Her voice held a hint of scandal, reminiscent of rumors, too juicy to ignore but too wild to believe outright. Anyway, he gives large parties. She shifted gears smoothly. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. As if on cue, the orchestra leader announced they were about to play Vladimir Tostov's Jazz History of the World, a piece that had caused a stir at Carnegie Hall. The garden erupted in anticipation and mock cheers. Gatsby reappeared at the top of the marble steps, surveying his domain with those sharp, approving eyes, untouched by the champagne or the chaos. He was the eye of a storm, calm, commanding, yet somehow distant from the revelry he orchestrated. As the night wore down, Jordan was summoned by Gatsby's butler, and she left with a mysterious air, promising to reveal secrets she then decided to keep. Meanwhile, the party spiraled around me, a spectacle of laughter, disputes, and the inevitable decline into drunken stupors and arguments that painted a vivid picture of the roaring 20s in all its gaudy glory. Stepping out into the night, I thought I'd grasp the essence of Gatsby's world, only to find it as elusive and fleeting as the echo of jazz music fading into the dawn. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man, and it got my curiosity buzzing. I would have accepted without question the idea that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York. That made sense, but young men didn't, at least in my limited experience they didn't, just drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. Jordan snapped me back to reality. Anyhow, he gives large parties, she said, her voice carrying a tone of urban disdain for the mundane. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. As if on cue, the boom of a bass drum punctuated the air, and the orchestra leader's voice soared above the garden's din. Ladies and gentlemen, he cried, at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we're going to play Mr. Vladimir Tostov's latest work. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation at Carnegie Hall last May. He smiled, a hint of condescension in his tone, adding, some sensation. The crowd laughed, as if on command. The piece is known, he continued with gusto, as Vladimir Tostov's Jazz History of the World. I was lost in the music, but my eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps, scanning the crowd with approving eyes. His tan skin was tight over his chiseled features, his hair cut meticulously. There was nothing sinister about him. I wondered if his abstinence from alcohol set him apart, as he seemed to grow more refined as the party's revelry escalated. When the Jazz History of the World concluded, The scene shifted to a more playful one. Girls draped themselves on men's shoulders, swooning backward into waiting arms, yet none of them fell on Gatsby. He stood apart, an island of detachment in the sea of conviviality. Out of nowhere, Gatsby's butler appeared beside us. "Miss Baker," he inquired. "Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone." "With me?" she said, genuinely surprised. "Yes, madame." She got up slowly, casting a puzzled glance my way, and followed the butler toward the house. Her evening dress moved with her like sportswear, as if she was used to the freedom of golf courses and crisp mornings. Left alone, I wandered. It was nearly 2, and strange sounds drifted from a room overlooking the terrace. Avoiding Jordan's undergraduate, now deep in conversation with 2 chorus girls, I slipped inside. The room was bustling. A girl in yellow played the piano, while a tall, red-haired chorus girl sang, slurring her words, tears mingling with mascara. She wept between lines, her sobs turning inky on her cheeks, until she collapsed into a vinous sleep. "She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband," a girl at my elbow explained. I glanced around. Arguments were breaking out everywhere. Husbands and wives, like Jordan's party, were at odds. One woman hissed, "You promised," at her husband, who was engrossed in a conversation with a young actress. In the hall, 2 sober men and their indignant wives argued. The women, bonding over shared grievances, lamented, "We're always the first to leave." "Well, we're almost the last tonight," one man muttered sheepishly. "The orchestra left half an hour ago." The argument ended with the wives being carried out, protesting into the night. As I waited for my hat, Jordan and Gatsby emerged from the library. Gatsby's formality returned as people approached to say goodbye. Jordan lingered, whispering to me, "I've just heard the most amazing thing." "How long were we in there?" "About an hour." "It was simply amazing," she repeated, but swore she couldn't tell. She yawned and waved as she melted into her party. Feeling a bit ashamed for staying so late, I joined the last guests clustered around Gatsby. I wanted to explain my earlier search for him. "Don't mention it," he said warmly, brushing my shoulder. "Don't give it another thought, old sport, and don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9. Then the butler, "Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night." "Good night, old sport," he smiled, making me feel like he'd wanted me to stay. As I walked down the steps, I saw the evening wasn't over. A dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre scene. A car in the ditch, minus a wheel, drew a crowd. A man in a long duster stood in the road, bewildered. "It went in the ditch," he explained, marveling at the fact. I recognized him as a recent visitor to Gatsby's library. "How'd it happen?" "I know nothing about mechanics," he shrugged. "But how did it happen?" "Don't ask me, I wasn't even trying to drive." A hush fell over the crowd. "Do you want to commit suicide?" "I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car." The crowd gasped as the coupe's door opened slowly. A pale man with a large dancing shoe stepped out, swaying in the headlights' glare. "Did we run out of gas?" he asked. "Look!" Half a dozen fingers pointed to the missing wheel. He stared at it, confused. "It came off," someone said. "At first I didn't notice we'd stopped." He straightened, asking, "Where's a gas station?" Men explained the car's condition. "Back out," he suggested. "Put her in reverse." "But the wheel's off." "No harm in trying." The horns crescendoed, and I turned away, cutting across the lawn. I glanced back once. The moon shone over Gatsby's house, his figure a solitary silhouette on the porch, hand raised in farewell. Reading over my notes, I see these events were mere moments in a crowded summer, overshadowed by my personal affairs. Most days I worked. Mornings I hurried through the white chasms of lower New York to the Probity Trust. I lunched with clerks in dark, crowded restaurants. I had a brief affair with a girl in accounting, but it ended when her brother glared too often. Dinners at the Yale Club were gloomy, followed by investment study in the library. I strolled Madison Avenue, imagining romantic encounters with women I passed. At twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness, shared by young clerks loitering before solitary dinners. Nights, the theater district's throbbing taxis made me wish I shared in their gaiety. I wished them well, feeling a part of their excitement. In midsummer, I reconnected with Jordan Baker. At first, flattered by her fame, I then felt a tender curiosity. Her affectations concealed something. At a house party, she left a borrowed car in the rain and lied about it, reminding me of a scandal from her golf days. Jordan avoided clever men to hide her dishonesty, a trait I could overlook. One day, she almost hit a workman with her car. "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "I am careful," she insisted. "Other people are. It takes two to make an accident." "I hate careless people. That's why I like you." Her words shifted our relationship, and I thought I loved her. But I knew I had to end things with a girl back home first. Writing weekly letters signed, "Love, Nick," I needed to break things off gently. Everyone suspects themselves of at least one cardinal virtue, and this is mine. I'm one of the few honest people I know. Chapter 4. Please like and subscribe to get more of this great content of classic books, reimagined. It was Sunday morning, church bells ringing in the villages along shore. The world and its mistress, dressed to the nines, poured back into Gatsby's mansion, laughing and twinkling on his manicured lawn. "He's a bootlegger, you know," one young lady whispered to another, drifting between his cocktails and his flowers. "Killed a man once. Fella found out he was von Hindenburg's nephew and cousin to the devil. Pass me a rose, sweetheart, and top off this crystal glass." I scribbled names of Gatsby's guests on an old train timetable that summer. It's disintegrating now, but I can still make out the gray names. They paint a better picture than any generalities I could offer. From East Egg came the Chester Beckers and the Leaches, a Yale man named Bunsen, and Dr. Webster Civet, who drowned last summer up in Maine. Then there were the Hornbeams, Willie Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackbuck, who always gathered in a corner, turning up their noses at anyone nearby. And the Ismays, the Christies, Hubert Auerbach and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, whose hair turned white one winter afternoon for no reason at all. Clarence Endive, also from East Egg, showed up once in white knickerbockers and got into a garden fight with a bum named Eddie. Further out on the island, the Chettles, O.R.P. Schraders, Stonewall Jackson Abrams of Georgia, the Fishguards, and Ripley Snells made appearances. Snell was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, too drunk on the gravel drive that Mrs. Ulysses Sweat's car ran over his hand. The Dancies came, S.B. Whitebait, Maurice A. Flink, the Hammerheads, Beluga the tobacco importer, and his girls. From West Egg, the Poles, the Mulreadys, Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Schoen, State Senator Gulick, Newton Orchid from Films par excellence, Eckhoust, Clyde Cohen, Don S. Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarty, all linked to the movies somehow. The Catlips, the Bembergs, G. Earl Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who strangled his wife, promoter Da Fontano, Ed LeGros, James B. Rotgut Ferret, the DeJongs, and Ernest Lilly came to gamble. When Ferret wandered into the garden, you knew he was cleaned out, and Associated Traction had to fluctuate profitably next day. Klipspringer was there so often he was known as the Border. The theatrical crowd included Gus Ways, Horace O'Donovan, Lester Meyer, George Duckweed, and Francis Bull. From New York came the Chromes, the Backheisens, the Denekers, Russell Betty, the Corrigans, the Kelleher's, the Dewars, the Scullys, S.W. Belcher, the Smirks, and the young Quinns, now divorced. Henry L. Palmetto killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClenahan always arrived with 4 girls, never quite the same, but so similar it felt like déjà vu. I forgot their names: Jacqueline, Consuela, Gloria, Judy, June, names of flowers and months or stern American capitalists. Faustina O'Brien, the Baedeker girls, young Brewer, who had his nose shot off in the war, Mr. Albrucksberger, and Miss Hagg, his fiancée, Ardita Fitzpeters, Mr. P. Jewett, once head of the American Legion, Miss Claudia Hipp with a reputed chauffeur, and a prince we called Duke came too. All these people graced Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one late July morning, Gatsby's sleek car lurched up my rocky drive, its horn blaring a 3-note melody. First time he called on me, though I'd been to 2 of his parties, cruised on his hydroplane and used his beach often. "Morning, old sport. Lunch today, right up together?" He balanced on the dashboard, every move slick and American, smooth like a guy who never had to lift anything heavier than a tennis racket in his youth. I admired his car. "Pretty, isn't it, old sport?" He hopped off, showing it off. "Seen it before?" I had. Everybody had. Cream-colored, bright with nickel, stuffed with hat boxes, supper boxes, tool boxes, layered with windshields reflecting the sun. We started to town, me behind layers of green leather. I'd talked to him maybe 6 times in the past month. Found, disappointingly, he had little to say. My impression of him as someone important faded. He was just the elaborate roadhouse owner next door. Then came that unsettling ride. Before we reached West Egg Village, Gatsby started leaving sentences unfinished, slapping his knee. "Look here, old sport," he blurted. "What's your opinion of me?" I fumbled with evasions. "Let me tell you about my life," he interrupted. "Don't want you getting the wrong idea from the stories you hear." He knew about the wild accusations. "I'll tell you the God's honest truth. I'm the son of wealthy people from the Middle West, all dead now. Educated at Oxford, family tradition." He looked sideways, and I got why Jordan Baker thought he was lying. He stumbled over "educated at Oxford" like it choked him. The whole statement crumbled, and I wondered if there wasn't something sinister about him. "What part of the Middle West?" I asked casually. "San Francisco." "Got it. My family died, and I came into money." His voice was solemn, haunted by the memory of that extinction. For a moment, I thought he was pulling my leg, but his look convinced me otherwise. "Then I lived like a Raja in Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, hunting, painting, trying to forget something sad." I almost laughed. The phrases were so worn they evoked nothing but a turbaned cartoon chasing a tiger. Then came the war. Tried hard to die but lived. Accepted a first lieutenant commission. In the Argonne Forest, I led a machine gun battalion forward. Left gaps on both sides where infantry couldn't advance. We stayed 2 days, 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. Found 3 German divisions insignia among the dead. Promoted to major, decorated by every Allied government, even little Montenegro. He lifted the words, smiling, appreciating Montenegro's history and struggle. His smile was infectious, my incredulity melting. He pulled a medal from his pocket. "From Montenegro." It looked authentic. "Ordere di Danilo," it read. "Montenegro Nicholas Rex." "Turn it." "Major J. Gatsby, for valor extraordinary." Here's another, a souvenir from Oxford days, taken in Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. The photo showed young men in blazers, Gatsby looking not much younger, holding a cricket bat. Then it was all true. I saw those tiger skins, blazing in his palace on the Grand Canal. He opened a chest full of rubies, the red glow reflecting off his broken heart. "I need a big favor today," he said, slipping his trinkets back into his pockets. "So I figured you should know more about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. I spend my time drifting, trying to forget the past." He paused, looking uneasy. "You'll hear about it this afternoon." "At lunch?" I asked. "No, later. I heard you're taking Miss Baker to tea." "Are you in love with Miss Baker?" "No, old sport, I'm not. But she's agreed to talk to you on my behalf." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was already irritated. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea to discuss J. Gatsby. I was sure his request would be something outrageous, and for a moment, I regretted ever stepping onto his crowded lawn. He clammed up as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where red-belted ocean liners were docked, then sped through a rundown slum with dark, empty saloons from the faded gilt era of the early 1900s. The Valley of Ashes spread out around us, and I saw Mrs. Wilson struggling at the garage pump, panting with effort as we drove by. Our fenders slicing through the light, we flew through Astoria, just half of it, before I heard the familiar jug spat of a motorcycle. A frantic cop pulled up alongside us. "All right, old sport," called Gatsby, slowing down. He flashed a white card from his wallet at the officer. "Right you are," the cop said, tipping his cap. "Know you next time, Mr. Gatsby." "Excuse me." "What was that?" I asked. "The picture of Oxford. I did the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year." We crossed the Great Bridge, sunlight flickering through the girders onto the moving cars. The city rose across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, a place built with dreams and non-olfactory money. The view from the Queensboro Bridge is always like seeing the city for the first time, filled with all the mystery and beauty in the world. A hearse passed us, piled high with flowers, followed by carriages with drawn blinds and more cheerful ones for the friends. They looked at us with tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe. I was glad Gatsby's fancy car was part of their somber day. We crossed Blackwell's Island, and a limousine rolled by, driven by a white chauffeur, with 3 stylish black passengers, 2 men and a woman. I laughed as their eyes rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've crossed this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Roaring noon in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar. I spotted Gatsby, his bright suit standing out in the dim anteroom. He was deep in conversation with another man. "Mr. Carraway, this is my friend Mr. Wolfsheim," Gatsby introduced. A small, flat-nosed man with a large head and tiny eyes in the darkness. Wolfsheim raised his gaze and shook my hand firmly. "I took one look at him," Wolfsheim said, shaking my hand earnestly. "And what do you think I did?" "What?" I asked, polite but puzzled. But he wasn't talking to me. He turned back to Gatsby, his expressive nose flaring. "I handed the money to Catspaw and said, 'Don't pay him a cent till he shuts his mouth.' And he shut it." Gatsby took us into the restaurant, and Wolfsheim stopped mid-sentence, falling into a dazed silence. "Highballs?" the head waiter offered. "This place is nice," Wolfsheim said, gazing at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling. "But I prefer the place across the street." "Yes, highballs," Gatsby agreed. "But it's too hot over there." "Hot and small, yes," Wolfsheim nodded, "but full of memories." "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole," he replied, gloom settling over his features. "Filled with faces, dead and gone, friends gone forever. I'll never forget the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. 6 of us at the table, Rosie eating and drinking all night. Near morning, the waiter says someone wants to see him outside. "All right," says Rosie, and I pull him back down. "Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you dare step outside." It was 4 a.m. If we'd raised the blinds, we'd have seen daylight. "Did he go?" I asked innocently. "Sure he went," Wolfsheim's nose flared indignantly. Turned around in the door, said, "Don't let the waiter take my coffee." Then he stepped out, and they shot him 3 times in the belly. 4 of them were electrocuted, I remembered. 5 with Becker, he corrected, eyes narrowing. "I hear you're looking for a business connection." The switch in topic startled me. Gatsby cut in. "Oh no, this isn't the man." "No?" Wolfsheim looked disappointed. "Just a friend. We'll talk business another time." "I'm sorry," Wolfsheim apologized. "I had the wrong man." The hash arrived, and Wolfsheim ate with delicate ferocity, his eyes sweeping the room slowly. He might have glanced under our table if I hadn't been there. "Look here, old sport," Gatsby leaned in. "I'm sorry if I made you angry this morning." His smile was back, but I resisted it. "I don't like mysteries," I said. "Why can't you be up front with me? Why all this through Miss Baker?" "Oh, it's nothing underhand," he assured me. "Miss Baker's a great sportswoman. She'd never do anything wrong." He glanced at his watch, jumped up, and hurried out, leaving me with Wolfsheim. "He has to make a call," Wolfsheim said, watching Gatsby. "Fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome and a perfect gentleman." "Yes. He's an Oxford man." "Oh. Studied at Oxford College in England, you know it?" "I've heard of it." "It's one of the most famous colleges in the world." "Known Gatsby long?" I asked. "Several years," he said proudly. "Met him after the war. Knew I'd found a man of fine breeding. Said to myself, that's the kind of man you introduce to your mother and sister." He paused. "I see you're looking at my cuff buttons." I hadn't been, but I did now. They were made of human molars. "Interesting idea," I said, inspecting them. "Yeah," he rolled his sleeves. "Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. Wouldn't look at a friend's wife." When Gatsby returned, Wolfsheim finished his coffee with a jerk and stood up. "Enjoyed lunch," he said, "but I'll leave you young men to your business." "Don't rush, Meyer," Gatsby said without enthusiasm. "You're polite, but I'm from another generation," Wolfsheim said solemnly. "You discuss your sports and young ladies and your—" He waved a hand. "I'm 50. I won't impose." As he left, his nose trembled. I wondered if I'd offended him. "He gets sentimental," Gatsby explained. "He's quite a character." "Who is he?" "A gambler," Gatsby said coolly. "Fixed the World Series in 1919. "Fixed the World Series?" The idea staggered me. I remembered the scandal, but it seemed inevitable, not the work of one man. How'd he do that? He saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? They can't catch him. He's smart. I paid the check, and as the waiter brought my change, I saw Tom Buchanan across the room. "Come with me," I said. "I need to say hello." Tom jumped up as we approached. "Where have you been? Daisy's furious you haven't called." "This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. Buchanan." They shook hands briefly, and Gatsby looked awkward. "How have you been?" Tom asked me. "How'd you end up here?" "Lunch with Mr. Gatsby," I said, turning to Gatsby, but he was gone. One October day in 1917, Jordan Baker, sitting up straight in a chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel, recounted the memory with the clarity of someone reliving it. "I was moving between sidewalks and lawns, preferring the lawns because I wore these new shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles. My plaid skirt fluttered in the breeze, making the red, white, and blue banners in front of the houses stretch out in disapproval. The biggest banner in the largest lawn belonged to Daisy Faye. She was 18, 2 years older than me, and the most popular girl in Louisville. Dressed in white, she had a little white roadster, and her phone rang all day with young officers from Camp Taylor eager to monopolize her time, even if just for an hour. That morning I saw her roadster parked at the curb, and Daisy was in it with a lieutenant I had never seen. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't notice me until I was right next to her. "Hello, Jordan," she called out. "Please come here." I was flattered. Of all the older girls, I admired Daisy the most. She asked if I was going to the Red Cross to make bandages. I was. She then asked if I could inform them she couldn't make it that day. The way the officer looked at her while she spoke was unforgettable. His name was J. Gatsby, and I wouldn't see him again for over 4 years. Even when I met him on Long Island, I didn't recognize him. That was 1917. By the next year, I had my own beau and was busy with tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy often. She ran with a slightly older crowd, and rumors flew, like the time her mother found her packing a bag to go to New York to say goodbye to a soldier. She was stopped, but didn't speak to her family for weeks after. She moved on to a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men who couldn't get into the army. By the next autumn, Daisy was as lively as ever. She had a debut after the armistice and was engaged to a man from New Orleans by February. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago with a wedding that Louisville had never seen before. He arrived with 100 people in 4 private cars, hired a whole floor at the Mulbach Hotel, and gave her a string of pearls worth $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. Half an hour before the bridal dinner, I found Daisy on her bed, beautiful in her flowered dress, and drunk. She had a bottle of Sauternes in one hand and a letter in the other. "Congratulations," she muttered. "Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it." "What's the matter, Daisy?" I asked, scared. I had never seen her like this. "Here, dearies." She fished out the string of pearls. "Take 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em Daisy's changed her mind." She started crying. I rushed out, found her mother's maid, and we got Daisy into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter, taking it into the tub, squeezing it into a wet ball, and finally letting me leave it in the soap dish when it began disintegrating. An hour later, we walked out of the room, Daisy with the pearls around her neck. The incident was over. The next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without a shiver and started a 3-month trip to the South Seas. When they came back to Santa Barbara, I had never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If Tom left the room, Daisy looked around uneasily and asked, "Where's Tom gone?" She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap for hours, touching his face and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching. In August, after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night, ripping a wheel off his car. The girl with him, a chambermaid from the Santa Barbara Hotel, got her arm broken and made the papers. By the next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them in Cannes and Deauville, and then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular, moving with a fast, young, rich crowd, yet maintained a perfect reputation. Maybe it was because she didn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among heavy drinkers. You can stay silent and time any little irregularity of your own. About 6 weeks ago, Daisy heard Gatsby's name for the first time in years. When I mentioned him to you, do you remember? She came into my room after you left and woke me up. "What Gatsby?" she asked. And when I described him, she said it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan finished, we left the plaza and drove through Central Park. The sun had set behind the movie stars' apartments in the West 50s, and children's voices, like crickets, rose through the twilight. "It was a strange coincidence," I said. "But it wasn't a coincidence at all." "Why not?" Gatsby bought that house so Daisy would be just across the bay. It wasn't just the stars he aspired to on that June night. He came alive to me, suddenly real with purpose. He wants to know, Jordan continued, if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over. The modesty of the request shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he entertained strangers, just to be near her. Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? He's afraid he's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's tough underneath it all. Something worried me. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh. He half expected her to wander into one of his parties, but she never did. Then he started asking people if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. That night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard how he worked up to it. Of course, I suggested lunch in New York, and he nearly went mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a friend of Tom's, he almost abandoned the idea. He doesn't know much about Tom, but he's read a Chicago paper for years, hoping to see Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's shoulder, drawing her close and asking her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking about Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but about this clean, hard, skeptical person next to me. A phrase beat in my ears with excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed through a barrier of dark trees, and then 59th Street's delicate pale light beamed into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her scornful mouth smiled, and I drew her closer, this time to my face.